Hello again. So we are going to continue reading The Sunflower, Conforming the Will of Man to the Will of God. I thought I'd change it up a bit. I love my icon corner. So I'm just cozied up in my icon corner. And I thought it was befitting to wear a mandili, I guess, while reading. Does not even match what I'm wearing, but I don't care. It's actually one of my favorite scarves because it has crabs on it and it makes me think of my friends in Maryland. If I could find the crabs, it's making me a liar now. They're on here somewhere. Anyway, that's not important. And as always, this is unedited and I don't pre-read. I mean, I've read this chapter before, but I don't remember, And I do have a problem with reading out loud, so I don't know if I mentioned that before. So I'm trying to help my friends who don't have time to read this book, so they can at least listen to it in the car or when they're, doing stuff around the house. And also to help me overcome reading out loud, because I mispronounce things all the time. So bear with me. We will struggle together. So without further ado, Chapter 3. How to recognize God's will in his inscrutable judgments. During the course of our entire life, we must often repeat the words of the prophet and King David. Thy justice is as the mountains of God. Thy judgments are as the bottomless deep. Psalms 35:7. What an abysmal depth in truth. The two servants of Pharaoh in the biblical story, the cupbearer and the baker, point to this depth, as it were. Both were servants of the same king. Both lost his favor. Both were arrested and imprisoned for their crimes. But both felt his wrath. He remembered both during a feast of his court, and he had the authority to forgive both, if this was pleasing to God's righteousness. Or he could execute them both. However, he condemned one to death, while the other he favored and reinstated in his previous position. He ordered the baker to be hanged and left as food for the crows, while he ordered the cupbearer to resume his duties. These are the judgments of God. Some he sends from his face, others he grants to see his face, according to his great mercy. For who can trace out his mighty words? Who will measure his majestic power with a number? And who will add to this measure while describing his mercies? Hidden and inscrutable are the judgments of God concerning Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, and concerning Pharaoh, who did not know Joseph. Blessed Augustine said, the one, Nebuchadnezzar, was punished by God for his countless sins, and through this punishment he was brought to Slavic and extremely beneficial repentance, improvement of himself. On the contrary, Pharaoh's heart was hardened. Despite the plagues of God, he disdained them and perished in the Red Sea with all his warriors. Both were human. Both were pagan kings. Both were punished. Why then were their ends so different? One acknowledged the punishing hand of God, sighed before God in repentance, and corrected his behavior. The other did not submit to the will of God as revealed to him, remained sinfully obstinate, and perished. Here's another example of the inscrutability of God's judgments. One of the greatest of the kings of Judah was Asa, who did what was right in God's sight and strengthened his kingdom by destroying all idols in the land of Judah. By exterminating the worship of idols, those abominations of the first kings of Judah. However, Asa, though a model king for 30 years, lost his original glory near the end of his reign, changing his behavior from the best to the worst. He imprisoned the prophet Hanani, who rebuked him for his misdeeds, and executed many innocent people. And finally, having fallen ill to a sickness of his feet, he did not turn to God in repentance for his sins or with a prayer for his healing. Instead, he turned to physicians and faith healers. Oh, how this changed was for the worst. Oh, how different were his later deeds from his former. He who was at first a righteous king became a self-assured disdainer of God's will, declared to him by God's prophet. On the contrary, Manasseh, who was lawless and unrighteous throughout his life, and who led the nation of Judah to such wickedness that they became worse than the nations God destroyed before the sons of Israel. Recognizing in his misfortunes the heavy hand of God, he turned to God and repented of his wickedness and received forgiveness and mercy from God. O God, truly your judgments are unfathomable, a measureless depth. Divine judgment concerning Saul and David, the first kings of the nation of Israel, could not be more different. They both were initially worthy of praise. They both committed serious sins that served as great temptations for their entire kingdom. They both were punished heavily by God, and yet how different they respond to these punishments. Saul became hardened in his wickedness and died tragically. David turned the punishment into spiritual medicine for himself, and he became the beloved chosen one of God. It is not appropriate to ask why this happened or why and for what reason. Such questions are inspired by the spirit of hatred, leading many to perdition. Has God indeed said, "You shall not eat from every tree of the garden"? Ask the most cunning of beasts. Eve should have answered him thus, "We know that God commanded us not to eat from only one tree, the tree of knowledge and good and evil. However, it is not for us to ask why he commanded this. It was pleasing to his holy will, and it is not right for us to doubt the reasons for his will. For who has known the mind of the Lord? Or who has become his counselor? Or who has first given to him, and it shall be repaid to him? For of him, through him, for of him and through him and to him are all things." Some will doubtless insist that it is not forbidden to sometimes ask for the reason for this or that commandment. But whom shall you ask? Will you ask God, who alone knows what is good and permissible? Imagine a servant demanding that the master give a reason for an order, or an employee asking his supervisor the reason for his last assignment. The master would consider himself insulted by the question, and his supervisor would be justified in considering his employment insubordinate. How can you dare to attempt such bizarreness before God? Other than his holy will, there is no other reason for God's providence. How unexplainable and wondrous to consider the following. The Samaritan eagerly listened to the words of the Lord and begged him to stay with them. The faithless Gergesenes, on the contrary, begged the Lord to leave them quickly. The faithless Jews were not instructed by any of the Lord's words, deeds, miracles, and signs, never coming to believe in the truth of his divine ministry. Your judgments, O Lord, are unfathomable. The holy martyr Julian of Alexandria had an ailment that prevented him from walking and was carried by 2 servants to his trial. One of the servants was also a Christian, but he rejected both Christ and his master, and he perished in idolatry. The other, named Eunuchus, rejected neither God nor his master. Remaining firm in his Christian faith, both confessors of Christ were first placed on camels and led around the city of Alexandria in dishonor and shame. And then they were subjected to merciless beatings. Finally, they were thrown onto a burning pyre alive, where, joyfully confessing Christ, they gave up their souls to God. One of the soldiers, named Bessas, seeing their endurance and commiserating with these innocent martyrs, began to rebuke the people and their bloodlust. He was seized, taken to the judge, and declared to be a Christian as well. The judge condemned him to death, and the executor cut off his head. Thus he received a martyr's crown in place of the Christian servant who rejected his master. St. Athanasius of Alexandria, in his life of St. Anthony the Great, describes the following event. 2 monks decided to visit St. Anthony in the desert, but they misjudged the difficulties of the journey, and they began to suffer from dehydration. One of them died, and the other was very near death. They were still several miles away from St. Anthony, who sat in the monastery on a stone. He called 2 of his monks and said to them, "Run quickly into the desert and take a skin of water with you, for one of the 2 brothers has already died of thirst, while the other still lives, but suffers greatly. If you do not hurry, the other will die as well." God revealed this to me while I stood at prayer. Having received his order, the monks immediately left, and having found the pilgrims, they buried the dead monk and refreshed the one still living with water and food, and then brought him to St. Anthony. While describing this event, St. Athanasius makes the observation that someone might as well ask, why did St. Anthony not send his monks a little earlier to save the one who died? Such a question truly is not appropriate for a Christian, for this was not the work of St. Anthony, but the judgment of God. God himself uttered his righteous judgment over the one dying and the one already died. He revealed his will to St. Anthony to save the one and not the other. St. Anthony the Great himself wondered at the hidden and inscrutable mysteries of God and called out to God in humility. O Lord my God, sometimes it pleases you to give a long life to people who appear worthless and steeped in an abyss of sin, and sometimes you end the lives of people who are very useful for society far before their time. Some who have sinned little, you punish heavily. Others live with no sorrows, happy, and though this becomes brazen to commit crimes. This injustice swelleth out like fat. Then St. Anthony heard a voice, "Pay attention to yourself, Anthony. That of which you ask is the judgment of God, and it is not for you to test or question it. How glorious are thy works, O Lord! Thy thoughts are very deep. These things as unwise man perceiveth not, and a fool doth not understand. Truly you are a mystical God, inscrutable to the mind of his creation." In 1117, when, according to Rodriguez of Apulia, All of Italy was struck by an earthquake. Some inhabitants of Milan had gathered in a house to discuss issues of government in the city. Suddenly, a voice was heard from the courtyard, calling one of those assembled out of the house. The man who was summoned had no idea who was calling him, therefore he hesitated at first, waiting for a reoccurrence of the call. Unexpectedly, some unknown man came up to the door and asked the man to quickly leave the house. No sooner had he walked out than the house collapsed, killing those within. Why was only one of them saved from death while the others died? The judgments of God are unfathomable. Who does not clearly see the base of these ancient miracles? Thus the angel of the Lord led Lot and his children out of Sodom, while all the others he left to the fire and brimstone. In the same miraculous manner, many other people have been saved from disasters, even though they were together with many other people who died. In 1597, a certain stubborn, intraceable person lived on the so-called Royal Mountain in Sicily. He lived a dissolute life. A certain acquaintance of his, a pious monk, admonished him in many ways, telling him to improve his manner of living and to cease his odious, ungodly life and his debauchery with prostitutes. But the man continued in his obstinacy, self-will and unbelief, refusing to be corrected. Some days passed after the monk's latest attempt to reform the man, and he died in the arms of a prostitute on her very bed, accidentally stabbed with a knife. In the same place, another sinner also lived many years with a kept woman. Hearing of his friend's demise, he ceased his sinful cohabitation and became he ceased his sinful cohabitation and became chaste. Learning from the punishment and death of his friend, he bitterly repented his sins for the remaining 60 years of his life. What can we say about all this except the judgments are as the bottomless deep? Man and beast shall thou save, O Lord. The Apostle Paul marveled at God's decree concerning Rebekah's twin Esau and Jacob, for though they were still in the womb, not yet having done anything good or evil that might predispose God toward either of them, God said, Jacob I have loved, but Esau I have hated. What shall we say then? It's their unrighteousness with God? Certainly not. But indeed, O man, who are you to reply against God? Will the thing formed say to him who formed it, why have you made me like this? Does not the proper honor and another for dishonor? In the distinction between potter and clay, any less than the distinction between God and man, a worthless worm, who dares to say to God, why did you do this? So Saint Dorotheos mentions the following event. In a certain city port, a ship filled with prisoners arrived, bound for the slave markets. Many buyers gathered. In that city lived a certain rich, virtuous, and pious maiden. Many buyers gathered. In that city lived a certain rich, virtuous, and pious maiden. She was very happy that the time had come for her to buy a servant girl, whom she desired to instruct in morality and proper feminine behavior. She eagerly approached the slaver, who had two young girls, one of whom which she bought for herself. As soon as she began to leave, another woman, she was the owner of a brothel, approached and paid some pathetic amount for the other girl, whom she then took to herself to train as a prostitute. What an unequal fate for these two young girls! Who will attempt to plumb the depth and mystery of these judgments of God? Both of these girls were innocent and young. Both were sold, knowing nothing of life awaiting them or their fate. Both were raised well, and both would have tended the fruit of their virtue during their lives. But only one was given to an instructor in a virtuous Christian life. She took full advantage of this instruction, and she became a good Christian, an emulator of the angels. The other girl was sent to a school of odious debauchery, to an instructor of falsehood, temptations, and all possible abominations, and she also willingly followed the example of her teacher. She became the devil's currency. Even though she may have followed a different path, she ended up with the better teacher. But your judgments, O Lord, are a bottomless deep. Except for a few differences, a similar situation occurred in St. Gregory the Great's family. This most holy man had three aunts, Emiliana, Tarsilia, and Gordiana, and all of whom dedicated their lives to Christ in a convent. Two of them, guarding their monastic vows, remained virgins until their death. The third, Gordiana, listened to no instruction and did not submit to her monastic authorities, ceased her communion with her holy sisters, and returned to a secular life, drawing back by her sensuality. Your judgments, O Lord, are a bottomless deep. Behold, the mighty one shall prevail by his strength. Who is so powerful as he? Who is he who examines his work, or who can say he has done unjustly? King David said, I was humbled and did not understand. I became a beast before thee. In other words, it is as if the king said, I am not testing your judgments, O God. I am nothing but before you. I am like the beasts, like in my duty, and listen to your voice, and to submit to my God, but not to assess your works and decrees. It is not strange that David, whom from childhood herded cattle and did not have goodness of his heart, and by God's inspiration, but even the seraphim, the highest spirit servants of God, do the same before God. For when the word of the Lord declared to the heavens and the earth that the Jews had rejected God, then the seraphim, which of whom has 6 wings, closed their faces with 2 wings, closed their feet with 2 wings, and flew with the other 2, revealing by his actions that they could not rise up to the heights of the miraculous and inscrutable works of God with their minds. For no created being can understand the divine judgments of the Almighty Creator. For them it is enough to know and to be convinced that the thrice holy God is holy, and to confess to each other the unutterable perfection of God, calling out to him, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. God is thrice holy. He is holy in himself, holy in his judgments, holy in his works. If the heavenly rational spirits humble themselves so, confessing the inscrutability of the divine mysteries, how much more should we, the weak, dust off the earth, though we have received by the gift of God, and breathe of life and the word of reason. Confess to God, crying out, "The Lord is righteous in all his ways, and holy in all his works." Blessed Augustine left us a great consolation in these words: God can save even without their good deeds, for he himself is good. He can destroy no one, for he himself is righteous. We often are amazed. We often see amazing changes and catastrophes, unexpected events in the world. Many such events are unpredictable enough for us to wonder about thy consciousness. Some servants shock us when their unexpectedness and complain pointlessly, saying, "I never thought or guessed that something like this could happen." How ignorant are we in anticipating future events? Even some events in the present defy explanation. We simply cannot fathom their course except in one important aspect, that is, we can determine whether something happened because it was pleasing to God, or because he allowed it to happen by his will, inscrutable but always righteous, and God and good providence. My ways but a heaven is distant from earth, so is my way distant from your ways, and your judgments and your thoughts from my mind. My counsels are not as your counsels, neither are your ways my ways, but as a heaven is distant from earth, so is my distance from your ways, and your thoughts from Marilyn. Marilyn, what am I saying? So is my way distant from your ways, and your thoughts from my mind. I'm very tired. But we're almost done. St. Gregory the Great said that searching out the secret reasons for God's judgments is nothing short of preferring our own sinful, proud opinions to his decrees. Our duty, our work, is to constantly, no matter what the unexpected circumstance, repeat the words of St. Paul. Oh, the depth of riches, both of the wisdom and knowledge of God! How unsearchable are his judgments, and his ways past finding out. Romans 11:33. In our earthly life, there is much we will never understand with our minds. It is enough for us to know, to become convinced, and to believe without doubt that God is never unjust, and on the last day of judgment, not a single person will be able to say anything to the Lord except these words: "Righteous art thou, O Lord, and true are thy judgments." At one time, King David, on seeing how the uprighteous prospered in the world, and tempted some of the members of God's people, desired to understand God's reasons for this. He thought about it for a long time, but he could not come to the satisfactory conclusion, and humbly admitted, "I sought to understand, but it was too hard for me, until I went into the sanctuary of God." We must defer our complete understanding from those judgments that remain inscrutable to us in the life. Only in the future shall we understand them and their final ends, and ordained by most high wisdom of God. Therefore, let us cease spreading the wings of our curious speculation concerning things that we cannot understand. The waves of the eternal ocean of the most high reason, constantly turning, the returning, rising, and falling, exceed the quickness of their keenest minds, not only human minds, but even angelic. And how could we expect to plumb the depths of God's judgment? Who can understand God's providence? Who can say why that man was born in paganism, whereas this man in Christianity? Who can say why the good news of the gospel came very late to so many countries? And why so many thousands of people perish without receiving the chance to be saved by Christ's teachings? Whereas in other countries the gospel message was heard and assimilated quickly, why in one kingdom full of heretics, therefore free of all defects and corruption, no? So many thousands of people perished without receiving the chance to be saved by Christ's teachings, whereas in other countries the gospel message was heard and assimilated quickly. Why is one kingdom full of heretics and another free of all defects of incorrect doctrine and full of true piety? Why does God postpone his punishments for sins for a time for some, whereas he punishes others immediately? Why are some innocent men convicted and executed, whereas the sins of others continue to have repercussions of their own children and further descendants? Why did the Crusades, in which so many kings and princes and corrupts put such a great effort into freeing the Palestine and the tomb of the Lord from the husband of the heartless, end up futile? Why did God give an opportunity for repentance to Adam, but not to Lucifer? Why did Jesus Christ have mercy on the fallen apostle Peter, but not on Judas? Why does one die as a child, whereas another live to deep old age? Why does one who sinned only a little die without repentance, whereas another who lived many years in debauchery finally improves and receives an end worthy of a Christian? Why does one draw in riches and luxury, whereas another has not a piece of bread or a penny to his name? O you most restless and excessively curious mind, why must you seek the answers to these questions? If you touch the fire of the divine judgment, the answers to these questions, if you touch the fire of the divine judgments, you will melt with the heat. If you climb the unattainable mountain of divine knowledge, foreknowledge, and providence, you will fail. You will fall. Like a moth or mosquito, you will fly in circles around the candle until it burns you. Thus, the human mind brazenly strives to pierce the secrets of the inconceivable divine fire. We mortal men cannot look directly at the works of the all-bright sun, since our eyes are blind as a bat. The hidden mysteries of God are unattainable for us in his life. The works of the Lord are wondrous, and his works are hidden from the works of the land of the Lord are wondrous, and his works are hidden from men. Not a single human being ever dared to take the scroll he who sits on the throne, except for the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David, the destroyer of death. This book is the book of the divine judgments, the inside being his foreordaining, the inside being for his ordaining, the outside his providence for his cosmos. See Revelations 5. The pre-eternal, all-wise God has ordered all things by measure, number, and weight. Wisdom of Solomon 11:20. So why do we worthless ones puff ourselves up with pride and brazenly seek to weigh the mass of fire, to measure the speed of wind, or to return yesterday for the present to the present? It is enough for us to believe that the reason for all things is the will of God, and whoever seeks another power or authority does not know the will of God. And whoever seeks another power or authority does not know the essence of God. Even every cause comes to be known in relation to another cause, and thus we have a series of causes that are dependent Every cause comes to be known in relation to another cause, and thus we have a series of causes that are all dependent on another. The cause that it is in essence had no previous cause in the first case. The reason for all other causes, but before God and his holy will, nothing existed. Nothing came before causes. Every cause comes to be known in relation to another cause, and thus we have a series of causes that are dependent on another. The cause that in the essence had no previous cause in the first case, the reason for all other causes, but before God and his holy Father, for this reason for all other causes, but before God and his holy will, nothing existed. Nothing came before God, and so the only cause of all causes is the pre-eternal one, the mighty and eternal God glorifying in the Trinity. What more do you seek? God allowed, God destroyed, God created everything in the just and wise in the just and wise words of salvation. In the just and wise words of Salvian, for us the most perfect truth must be the will of God. The highest wisdom must be a willing and calm acceptance of his decrees and divine will and providence. I am super tired. All right, so that ends chapter 3. Chapter 4 is how to determine God's will in all events and actions. So we'll read that later. Have a nice night.